A lot of people remember seeing this guy as the game show host of the hit game show Press Your Luck, No Whammies, back in the early 1980s, but you might be surprised to know that this same guy was the host for pretty much every other game show ever invented. His name is Peter Tomarken, and you might also be surprised to know that he was a pilot who volunteered his time with an awesome nonprofit called Angel Flight, which sadly ended before it was ever really able to begin. The tragic story of Peter Tomarken coming up on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, as pretty much with all of my stories, this one comes from a viewer request. So feel free to send me a story request in the comments below or send me an email or something and I'll take a look. But this was a non-commercial, personal Part 91 flight, so there is no operator here. Peter Tomarken owned this plane himself with a friend of his, but before we get into the flight, let's actually take a look at who Peter Tomarken was and the wild life he led up until this accident. Now, Peter was born in the middle of nowhere near the small town of Olean in central New York, and then moved with his parents to the sprawling suburbs of Beverly Hills in the 1950s, where he graduated from Beverly Hills High School in 1960 and then completed a bachelor's degree from U.S.A. And Peter quickly married his first wife, Dana, who herself was quite accomplished, where she served on the Board of Education, as well as working with the Grammys and basically running the very famous music charity Music Cares for several decades. Now, Peter and Dana had 3 awesome kids, including the twins Alexis and Candace, who appeared on a Christmas episode of Press Your Luck. And then after college, Peter quickly got into the advertising world, where he worked for several magazines in New York City before then coming back to Los Angeles, and he even scored an acting deal on the NBC show called Cliffhangers. He eventually ended up creating his very own advertising firm where he was the star of his own commercials before getting tapped to host his first game show called Hitman, which lasted just a few months in 1983. And during this time, Peter even co-hosted a show on Playboy TV called Playboy on the Scene, but then finally scored the big deal to host Press Your Luck, which strangely only lasted about 3.5 years. You know, I feel like I've seen Press Your Luck like 10,000 times, but I think that's probably because there were almost 800 episodes over those 4 years, and the show ran a million reruns forever on both the U.S.A. network and the Game Show Network. But after Press Your Luck came to an end, Peter continued to find a way to host game shows for nearly 15 more years, starting with a game show called Wordplay in 1986, Bargain Hunters in 1987, Wipeout, which is a show he co-produced in 1988 and 89. He then hosted a pilot episode for a Monopoly game show. He produced an entire season of America's Funniest People. He wrote and produced episodes for Real Stories of the Highway Patrol. And then in the mid-1990s, he hosted the super strange show called Decades, which was a live interactive game show that literally took place on the actual set of Wheel of Fortune, and then finished out his game show hosting days in 2000 by hosting the Fox Family game show Paranoia, where the goal was literally to give the contestants a full-blown anxiety attack while they thought about their trivia answers. Anyway, Peter's game show hosting days were over and he retired to a life of being a real estate agent, but just a few years into retirement, and along with his second wife, Kathleen, Peter decided to join the charitable cause called Angel Flight. Now, Angel Flight, which is still in existence today, is a nonprofit charity located at the Santa Monica Airport whose overall mission is to utilize volunteer pilots to transport non-emergency patients who are in need of some form of non-emergent medical treatment. Now, there are no medical providers on these flights, and the patients do need to be medically stable and ambulatory, but there are many instances where somebody can get sick or hurt out of state, or maybe they are moving, or maybe even someone is not even a patient, but they need to get from San Diego to the home of their dying father in San Francisco or something. If they want to do that, they can request a flight through Angel Flight's website, and if the financial or medical need is great enough, the flight could get approved. Angel Flight will then either offer a commercial plane ticket at no cost, or they might tap one of their volunteer pilots who might be available with their very own plane to pick up the patient or their family member and fly them to where they need to be. Now, I think this is an absolutely amazing service to the communities and citizens out on the West Coast, with Angel Flight making a huge impact over the years as they fly almost 5,000 flights a year and have been doing this since 1983. And they even have a network of drivers on the ground so they can pick you up and drop you off at the airport. So, if you're ever interested in actually volunteering with this group, or maybe donating to them, or even utilizing their service, be sure to check the link below to find their site and get more information. Now, the aircraft in this accident is the tried and true Beech A36 with tail number November 16 Juliet Romeo, otherwise simply known as the Beechcraft Bonanza. Now, there are a million versions of the Bonanza out there, but the main variants are the 33, the 35, and the 36, with the 35 being the original version dating all the way back to 1947 and having the easily recognizable V-tail, with the 33 coming along in 1960 and having the conventional tail, and finally the 36, which they still make today, which is a stretched version of the 33. All in all, they have built almost 19,000 Bonanzas, and to put that into perspective, even going way back to the very first Boeing 737 in 1966, they have only made about 12,000 737s. Now, the current model that they make today is called the G36, which has a beautiful glass cockpit and a Garmin 1000 system, but the aircraft in this accident was an A36 that was built way back in 1973 and had a total of 3,555 hours on the airframe. Now, this A36 was powered by the rock-solid Teledyne Continental IO 520BA flat six-cylinder engine with only 735 hours on the clock and putting out about 285 horsepower through a Macaulay prop. Now, the weather was absolutely gorgeous on this day with variable winds at 4 knots, 100 miles of visibility, clear skies with 55-degree temps and 35-degree dew point. Weather was absolutely beautiful. Now, Peter was still kind of a newer private pilot, but he was experienced enough with just 428 hours, with nearly half of those hours, though, on this aircraft type. He did hold a private pilot certificate and an instrument rating, and had a third-class medical certificate issued in 2005, with the only restriction being that he had to wear corrective lenses. Now, on the morning of March 13th, 2006, Peter did receive a request for a mission with Angel Flight. Now, don't get on me for that word mission. That is Angel Flight's word. I'm fully aware that mission is probably not the best term to use for helicopter air ambulance operations, but just in full disclosure, that's the term that they use. So Peter receives the request, he grabs Kathleen, and they head to Santa Monica Airport to prepare for a flight to Brownfield Municipal Airport down in San Diego, California, to pick up a cancer patient who needs transportation back up to Los Angeles to go to UCLA Medical Center for cancer treatment. Now, Peter lines up on runway 21, which is just a few miles north of LAX, and begins his takeoff without incident. He plans to climb out of the airport and transition south towards San Diego just after crossing into the Pacific Ocean over the Santa Monica beach. Now, the aircraft makes it just about 2 miles west of the airport when Peter gets on the radio and states that he had a power loss and is turning around to return to Santa Monica Airport. Now, Peter does a great job and he does get the aircraft turned back around, but simply does not have the altitude to make it back to the airport. And again, he radios to state that he was going to attempt to land the airplane directly on the beach. But he comes up about 250 yards short, and the impact itself was actually captured by still photography by a photographer on the beach. Now, there were plenty of witnesses there, and they stated that the aircraft did impact the water pretty level and with the landing gear up. The aircraft then begins to sink pretty quickly in just about 20 feet of water. Now, the fire department quickly gets on scene and is able to raise the aircraft with their airbags to find that both Peter and Kathleen were killed in this accident. Now, Peter actually filed an instrument flight plan to San Diego, and on his instrument paperwork, he actually listed that there were 3 souls on board. Now, rescuers actually did a thorough search for a third unknown occupant, but they never found anybody. And friends and family of Peter and Kathleen stated that they were unaware of who that third person would have or could have been. Either way, they were never found. So what happened here? Well, obviously there was a power failure, as Peter was heard on the radio stating so, but as always, man, there is far more to this story. First, a water landing in this Bonanza on a calm day right off of shore with the landing gear up certainly seems like it could have been a survivable accident. The impact with the water did not destroy the plane, and there was obviously no post-impact fire, and there was hardly any damage inside of the aircraft. The cause of death for Peter and Kathleen was not trauma, but it was drowning. You see, the A36 back in the 1970s was only equipped with a lap belt, which through lots of data with automotive and aviation accidents over the years has shown to sometimes make impacts worse, as lap belts offer no protection to the upper body, especially from keeping the head from moving back and forth, forward and backwards in an accident. This is why shoulder belts became required in cars way back in 1968, but for small airplanes, this requirement did not become mandatory for newly manufactured airplanes until 1986. And remember, this aircraft was made in 1973. However, about the same time the requirement for new planes to have shoulder harnesses went into effect in 86, Raytheon, which acquired Beech in 1980 only to merge with Hawker in 1994 and then be bought out by Textron in 2013. Anyway, Raytheon did issue a mandatory service bulletin number 2031 to announce the availability of a shoulder harness retrofit for just about all of their older models, including this A36 model, with multiple incentives and reminders given to all owners over the next decade. They even cited hard data that showed that while harnesses will only protect occupants in very minor impacts, the shoulder harnesses specifically, though, will reduce overall injuries by 88% and reduce fatalities by 20%. Dude, I will take that 20% all day long. But this plane that Peter was flying never had the shoulder harnesses installed. And based on Peter and Kathleen's injuries, they both most likely bumped their heads on the yoke or the ceiling or the dash of the aircraft when the plane hit the water and either knocked them unconscious or left them a bit dazed and confused. But either way, they were then unable to exit the aircraft and subsequently drowned. And we know that they were still breathing when the airplane sank, as both of their lungs were full of water on the autopsy. Well, what caused the power loss? I mean, these Continental engines are absolutely bulletproof, right? Well, yes, when all of the bolts are tightened. You see, this Continental Flat 6 is an air-cooled flat 6-cylinder engine with an amazing safety record. Now, the engine still requires maintenance, but typically as long as these engines are meticulously maintained, as any aircraft engine should be, they will last for decades. And this is shown to be the case as they have made tens of thousands of these engines. And they don't just power the Bonanza, but they also power the Beechcraft Baron, as well as the Cessna 206, 210, 310, 340, and the 421. Now, on a quick inspection of the engine, it was 150% obvious that the number 2 connecting rod violently blasted through the side of the engine case, which would have immediately seized this engine up, and all power would have disappeared instantaneously. Well, what can cause an engine to throw a rod like this? Well, there are typically really only 2 big reasons that cause something like this to happen. First would be something that caused a rod bearing failure, such as spinning the bearing or an oil starvation issue, and the other one would be some type of failure of the rod itself and the components that hold it all together. Now, there's only so many parts that go with a piston and rod. I mean, there's a piston and there's a pin and clips. There's a piston bearing and the rod cap that goes with it and the bolts as well. Now, those things could come loose and fail, but it's pretty rare. But these engines are built to last, and they are not super high torque or super high horsepower. And everything on these engines is built to last and is protected by some form of redundancy. Now, one area of redundancy that is on this engine that you would probably certainly never see on any modern automobile engine would be right here with these rod bearing caps. Now, I actually have a connecting rod out of one of these Continental 520 engines right here. So we're going to take a look at it and take a look at some of the parts and how it goes together. And I also have a connecting rod out of a pretty generic vehicle, and it kind of represents what a modern connecting rod might look like. But first, let's take a look at this connecting rod here. So there's only so many parts, and if you don't know what it is, you can, or if you already know what it is, you can fast forward through it, but we will come back to this to look at where a failure point might be. But in this particular case, this is a pretty big connecting rod, and I believe that this is probably forged. If it's cast, you can probably let me know in the comments below. But nonetheless, there'll be a bearing that goes in here, probably a roller bearing that's on a piston pin, and then the piston sits on top right here and is held in place by 2 clips. And then at the bottom, you actually have the connecting rod bearing cap that goes around the crankshaft journal and is held in place at least on this connecting rod, with 2 bolts and nuts. So these nuts that you see on here are actually have little holes in them, and then the end of the bolts have holes in them too to put a cotter pin. And so I'm gonna quickly unscrew these and take this apart. Okay, and so when we take it apart, these bolts can actually come out. I'm not going to take them both out because they're kind of a pain to put back in there. But nonetheless, here is your bolt, and you can kind of take a look right here. You might be able to see up close the hole that is in that bolt. But nonetheless, that's where a cotter pin would go through. And then here I have 2 cotter pins sitting over here to the side that you can see. And then here is a nut that would have the grooves to be able to have the cotter pin go through it. You can see it, okay? And so on this particular kind of connecting rod, these are probably machined separately because this is an older design going back going back almost 80 years now. And so they don't fit together as precise as connecting rods today do. But when you put it together, there'd be a bearing insert that goes in here. This bolt would go through, and then you would tighten down these nuts to a certain torque specification. And then the torque specification on this one should be anywhere between 475 and 525 inch-pounds, which I don't know how many foot-pounds is that. Alexa, what's 500 divided by 12?
500 divided by 12 is approximately 41.6667.
Yeah, what she said. So it's about 41 foot-pounds worth of torque, which is actually pretty high torque compared to today. But they would torque this down to about 41 foot-pounds or 500 inch-pounds. And they would take this cotter pin, which you can see how small this is. I don't know if that's going to show up right there, but you can see how small that cotter pin is, which is a redundancy step. And then you would take that cotter pin and you would slide it directly through the groove in the nut as well as the hole in the bolt, and it would come out the other end. And then you can either use your fingers or you can use a set of pliers like I have. But typically you can bend these smaller ones over just with your fingers, and then it would look something like that. Okay, hold up both of these cameras so you can try to get a good look at what that might look like. Okay, and so all that cotter pin does is prevents, if somehow this nut was to come loose, is to prevent it from backing out once it is torqued all the way down. Today, that is not really used, and so this is a connecting rod piston out of I believe this is out of a Hyundai Sonata. And you can see how much more precise this thing is. And this is why engines last hundreds of thousands of miles today, as long as you do good oil change on them, is because the clearances are more precise and things are more precise, even though it is a junky Hyundai that, you know, they give you a new engine every 100,000 miles or whatever. But either way, as we take this one apart, you see that there's no nuts on this one. This one has 12-point bolts, 12-point heads to the bearing cap bolts. And so as we unscrew this one, these bolts are far more precision than the bolts in the 520 in the Continental engine. And then this connecting rod cap, if I didn't even let go of this, it would be almost impossible, at least especially over on this end right here. You can kind of see that it's almost impossible to see where the groove is, because these are usually made as one piece, and then they are literally brought down to a very low temperature, and then they are cracked. And so you can see that that hole or that connection there does not look like it's very precise. It looks all jagged, right? But it's 100% precise because it was broken that way. And when you put it back together, it makes a perfect connection. And that's how a lot of connecting rods are made today. But nonetheless, there is no cotter pin on this because it bolts directly into the bottom of the connecting rod as opposed to bolting into a nut. And I just don't know of any engines that are made today that these bolts would still go into a nut. I think that's just an older technology. I'm sure that there's some that are out there. You guys can probably correct me if I'm wrong. But with these 12-point heads and these precision bolts and the precision machining that's in here, there's no need for it. And so there's no need for a cotter pin, and there's one less place to fail. So we'll kind of come back to that, but that's generally how these go together. Again, I'm overgeneralizing a little bit, just trying to give you a visual of what it looks like. All right, so now this being an air-cooled engine, the cylinders can actually be removed during maintenance to either replace the pistons or to hone the cylinders or maybe to replace the rings or something like that. And they can do this without actually having to remove the crankshaft, as the cylinders can be removed separately from the rest of the engine. Now, removing the crankshaft obviously would mean that they would also have to remove those connecting rods, right? Well, what do the records say? Well, the records tell us that the engine was completely overhauled back in 1977 and then again in 1998, so 21 years apart. And we know that in 1998, the connecting rod bearings and the nuts and bolts all had to be replaced. So the bearing that goes in here, the nuts, and the bolts all had to be replaced in 1998. So it was then placed into storage for a year and then was taken out of storage, and the cylinders were removed again for inspection. But the connecting rods themselves were not disassembled, which means that there would be no confirmation at this inspection that this cotter pin right here was actually still there. Then in 2004, due to some low compression and some blow-by issues, the cylinders again were removed once more so that they could be repaired, but again, the connecting rods were not disassembled. Now, the engine was not disassembled again before this accident occurred in March of 2006. Now, the engine itself would have accumulated about 234 hours since the last time the cylinders would have been removed. Now, I keep mentioning when the cylinders were removed because if this cotter pin right here was never installed or somehow it fell out, it could easily be seen by the naked eye if the mechanic was somehow looking for it. But there's really nothing to document during these inspections, like cotter pins were all accounted for or something like that. You know, is it possible that the cotter pin was there and it fell out or it worked its way out? Yes, it is. Is it possible that the cotter pin was missing and the mechanic just didn't see it before reinstalling the cylinders, and the original mechanic who revamped the engine never put the cotter pin in? Yes, that's also a yes. But the oil was also changed on this engine 4 times after the last cylinder removal and up until the crash, and each time the oil was sent for an analysis. Now, the results of those analyses showed that there was aluminum in the engine oil that appeared high and that wear metals were also high, possibly due to piston wear. Now, wear like this can sometimes be a common finding and is typically used for trending, over a period of time, but it can also be a sign that there is abnormal wear in the engine. In this case, possibly from a cotter pin that fell out and was bouncing around in the engine and eventually was ground up. Further post-accident analysis, though, showed that there were no other signs in the engine of heat failure or component failure other than this connecting rod coming apart. Investigators, though, also checked all of the remaining connecting rod bolts and found that the cotter pins were present on all 5 of the other connecting rods, and they also measured all of the torque values for the bolts on all 5 of the remaining connecting rods and all of that hardware, and they found that the number 1 and the number 3 connecting rod bolts were under torqued and were not within the manufacturer's specified torque range, which should have been at about 500, and these ones were closer to around 300 something. So, was it under torqued rod nuts that caused this failure? Man, it's hard to say for sure, but maybe? You see, check out the rod nuts and bolts though from the failed number 2 connecting rod in this picture. On this nut here, we can see that many of the threads inside the nut were actually sheared off as if the nut itself were pulled or ripped off of the bolt. But right here, we can also see that there are about 4 threads within this nut that are perfectly fine, and they are all at the top of the nut. Now, this is a clear indication that the nut was already loosened about 4 turns before it actually was sheared off. So again, let's take a look at this connecting rod, and I'll show you what I mean. So on this one over here, you can see on the left over here, you can see the cotter pin is there, and there's no cotter pin over on this side. So cotter pin here, no cotter pin. And so imagine if the cotter pin fell out or if it was never actually installed in the first place. We know that this nut was at least backed out 4 full turns. So I'm going to turn it 8 half turns to get it to about the right distance. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that means that this nut was roughly about this distance backed out when it when this connecting rod came apart and sheared this nut directly off the side of this bolt. Now, the only way that that could happen is if there was no cotter pin there. So was the cotter pin never there in the first place? Did it somehow get sheared off because this was under torqued? Because we know that number 1 and number 3 were under torqued. It's kind of hard to tell, but what we do know is that this nut right here, this nut right here, backed out this much and then was completely sheared off of this bolt, which made this entire thing come apart and then sent this connecting rod straight through the side of this engine, which seized up the engine and lost all power for Peter and his wife instantaneously. And, you know, it appears that Peter did a good job of doing an emergency water ditch, but because the Bonanza was not outfitted with those shoulder harnesses, both Peter and Kathleen bumped their noggins on something inside the aircraft, rendering them unconscious, maybe just for a few seconds, and they were unable to escape the aircraft, and then they both subsequently drowned. And to make this whole story even more tragic, this was Peter's first mission with Angel Flight. And in the end, the NTSB's probable cause was listed as the failure of an aviation maintenance technician to properly torque and cotter pin the number 2 connecting rod bolts at their attach point to the crankshaft, which resulted in the separation of the connecting rod in flight and complete power loss. Well, I'm not sure one can definitively say that this failure was especially caused by some mechanic not torquing the nuts properly or not installing a cotter pin. The records simply are not there to prove that. All we really can conclude from this evidence is that this nut backed out at least 4 turns, which led to this connecting rod coming apart and grenading through the side of the engine. Now, based on the records and the timeline, though, there is really no way to know for sure if this cotter pin was ever even installed in the first place. However, since the number 1 and the number 3 rods were under torqued, it does seem likely that at least this number 2 rod was also under torqued. Either way, I think we have obviously pointed out the importance of quality maintenance records and quality mechanic work, and also that when you have repeated oil analyses that show metal in the oil, that this should be a telltale sign that there might be a bigger problem. But we cannot ignore the importance of sharing information when it comes to safety incidents like this. Peter co-owned this plane with his buddy, Dr. Carlin, who stated he was never made aware of the shoulder harnesses bulletin and that he probably would have installed them had he been informed. Now, I have seen this several times myself, and this same lack of communication could have prevented the U.S.A. heart transplant helicopter crash, as well as multiple air ambulance crashes in A-Star 350s and EC-130s related to leaving the aircraft outside in freezing precipitation. So, I hope the word gets out, and all these years later, I can assure you that there are probably still Bonanzas flying around with only lap belts where the owner doesn't know that there's a retrofit available. We can all do better at sharing the info. Either way, I hope you all enjoyed this story, and if you found it even remotely interesting and learned a thing or two, please feel free to like and subscribe, because that is the only thing, it's literally the only thing that still keeps this channel going. As always, y'all stay safe, say something nice to someone today, and I hope to see you all on the next episode.